The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the sponsors, advertisers, or presenters. Advertising does not imply endorsement by the sponsors and presenters.
Welcome to the Lighting Controls Podcast, everyone. We got a great episode for you today with Tom Ladd from Pharos Lighting Controls. Really interesting stuff about DMX and some cool project-related stuff. But before we get into that, just wanted to let you know that this podcast is presented by the Lighting Controls Association, or LCA.
And financially supported by NAILD, the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors. And for those of you who can't get enough of Webster and Ron, Webster's got some more information for you on some upcoming instructional teachings and videos and in-person events that we'll be at.
Yeah, so starting off with Southern California Edison, which is one of the largest electric utilities in the United States and a long-term leader in energy efficiencies. They're headquartered in Rosemead, California. They serve approximately 15 million people, but they're also serving you online with some free webinar content on lighting controls. I will be teaching it starting in May. Check out the link in the description. But additionally, Ron and I are going to be at Light Fair. If you're going to be at Light Fair as well, you should come find us, chat, or even see some of our seminars. Ron and I are doing one seminar on Wednesday, which is going to be on integration case studies, really cool stuff. But additionally, I'll be teaching 3 other courses, so check them out if you're going to be there. And now, here's Tom. Welcome back to the Lighting Controls Podcast, everyone, where we just like talking about lighting controls. Today, we've got Tom Ladd. Tom, do you want to give us a quick breakdown on who you are and what you do?
Sure. So, Tom Ladd. I work for Pharos Architectural Controls. I've been with them for about, 14 years. A mixture of technical and sales roles, but really passionate about lighting control, passionate about integration, passionate about DMX and making DMX really sort of an easier protocol to use in architecture, because I think we're seeing architecture use it more. I love to tinker. I'm a sales guy now, but as you can see behind me, I work in an attic, and I love to take things apart, put things together, blow them up, and just kind of like lighting control is really cool, and what you can make it do in automation is sort of what interests me the most.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. I mean, I think the topic of DMX has come up a lot lately, and so talking to a manufacturer about DMX, what your perspective is going to be really interesting to hear on the heels of all these other conversations we've had. And so, the first thing that I want to hear from you, where do you think DMX fits into this whole conversation of lighting controls?
Yeah, it's interesting. So if you had asked me that 6 or 7 years ago, I would have said, well, DMX works itself into architecture with a specialty element to an architectural project. So colored lighting in a lobby or a facade or something that was enhancing architecture. And I wouldn't have said that I saw many projects where actual functional lighting to light people in their spaces and their environments that they work and play in. I would never have expected that to be something back then, but I think that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing, I think, from our perspective, we're seeing 2 types of manufacturers out there developing lights using DMX. We're seeing ones that their fixture line has been born from perhaps their entertainment division of their company, or they are really good lighting manufacturers that have been in the industry a long time, and they found their way to make their lights even better is to bring some sort of digital control element to them, whether it's tunable white or color. And so from our perspective, we're starting to see a lot more of DMX in the market. We have many customers that come to us to say, hey, I can, many projects come to us to say, hey, I have 0 to 10 volt, I have phase control dimming, I have brand A or brand B that's providing me control. How do I make DMX sort of a native protocol as part of our system? And that's what we're trying to do as Pharos, is try to make DMX easier for people to use in the industry, and to get the quality out of the light that the manufacturers are basically designing them to do in terms of white and color. So I think it's very interesting. I think there, in terms of the protocols out there today, the other one that we see occasionally in the U.S. but hasn't taken on so much as Dolly, and I think that's something we see a lot overseas, since we sell all over the world. But it's those digital protocols that I think are giving designers and giving projects sort of a new element of control, a new element of adapting the quality of light for their projects. So I still think it's up and coming in the architecture industry. I think something would have to happen to push it out that would be better. But I think we could crystal ball that, and we'd all be much wiser people. But I don't think we're going to be able to crystal ball that right now.
No, of course not. And I think Dolly's a great example of a good idea that never took off in the U.S. or in North America. And so it's, the question is begged why DMX wouldn't follow the same. And my perspective, anyways, I would see it as, because it's backed by theater. Theater is supporting DMX, and so it's not like it's going to disappear. But at the same time, it seems like it covers a different base than Dolly does.
I think so. I mean, the two big differences, well, the big difference between DMX and the other protocols that are used in lighting control, certainly the digital protocols, is DMX is streaming. So it's very, very fast. Standard DMX is 33 hertz. You can get up to 40 hertz, and we now can push DMX to 60 hertz. And with 60 hertz DMX, you're now pushing into that video realm of how fast you can change the color of individual pixels.
And so, just to stop you, so that our listeners understand what you mean by streaming.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So what is streaming?
Yeah, sure. So I don't want to oversimplify this, but fixtures controlled by DMX essentially aren't in control of their own smarts in terms of when to make a change or how to mix color. Some fixtures are, but at the end of the day, 33 times a second, we're telling that fixture to be at this color and at this intensity. So if you picture somebody with a bag of ping pong balls throwing ping pong balls at you 33 every second, that fixture has to grab the ping pong ball, look at what the intensity value is, and make the change. It's not like DMX can stop and the fixtures know what to do. It can't stop. What that means is that you can have very fast changes. You can also have very smooth changes over time, perhaps time that would exceed other protocols. You can set a Dolly fixture to have a fade time of 2 or 3 minutes. You could set a DMX fixture to have a fade time over the course of 2 days. So there's a lot more power, because you are telling that fixture what to do every single moment of the day, of the second.
As opposed to contrast with Dolly, where you send a command packet, that packet gets received by the driver, and then the driver carries out those actions. So Correct. You say, go to 100% over 5 seconds, it gets sent to the driver, and there's no communication after that. And so if you were to cut that line, it would still carry that last command.
Yep, absolutely. It would essentially hold its last look, as we say in the entertainment world. And many fixtures of DMX do that as well. I think Dolly, though, if you were to look at some of the new Dolly 2 protocols coming out, or the Dolly 2 protocol, I think we'll see that in architecture, even with changing color in terms of hue and saturation, rich color. Architecture sometimes doesn't need the streaming. Packeted information is just great, as long as you can control how that fade occurs, how long, when it occurs, obviously, is when the packet's sent, and where to go for a color value, whether it's a tunable white fixture or color. And I think that DALI 2 as a protocol will become pretty attractive for people moving forward. I just don't know how fast it will cross the pond and come over here to get embraced. So I think, in terms of the difference between the streaming DMX and the packeted DALI, I think designers still have really two cool tools to work with in terms of moving color. And certainly if you're lighting a facade, you may want the faster streaming protocol so that you can do some fancier things on the facade, versus, if you're dealing with like a conference room that has some accent colored lighting around the cove or a cove, that's something that maybe you don't need the DMX streaming. DALI's funny, because DALI does exist here in the States via many manufacturers. And a lot of the manufacturers, the big manufacturers that control light, actually use sort of the DALI foundation of their own proprietary protocol. It's not DALI specific, but if I had to rattle off some manufacturer names, I could probably list about 5 or 6 that use DALI. So DALI made it here. Someone saw the light, pardon the pun, that this could be a really good protocol, but sort of never made it an open standard for their gear.
Yeah, and additionally, you're seeing DALI as more of a back end in the States as opposed to a front end protocol, because you're not directly controlling fixtures in a lot of cases. You're translating to 0 to 10 in the States. And whereas DMX, you rarely see that where you're translating out to another protocol. It's usually straight to the fixture with DMX. But you don't see a lot of back end DMX.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it, because I just went back through those manufacturers, and you're right. There's about 3 or 4 of them that they're using it as a means to an end, but the means to the end is just to connect to a fixture that's been on a conventional, dimmer or 0 to 10. Certainly, when it comes to control stations, what a person or a user or a customer might end up touching, that may be native. But that could also be considered back end. But that's a really good, interesting way to put it. So DALI, as we know it in Europe and elsewhere, where you have both a control system and natively talking to fixtures, natively talking to control stations, and those fixtures and control stations are compatible with just anybody's DALI. That's going to be interesting to see how that comes over here. I do know there's a lot of. Go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say is it kind of highlights the different preference functionality of the two protocols, because, like you said, not everything needs that streaming capability. But at the same time, when you want that streaming capability, it's going to have to be from system to fixture. And whereas DALI operates much more like a network format, where it sends information and doesn't expect this feedback loop to be continuously saturating the network. So, ideally, maybe there is a world in which DALI and DMX work together as opposed to against each other, because they really do fill in different parts of a control system.
Yeah, I mean, from an integration standpoint, we do dozens of jobs a year that DALI is actually used as an integration protocol. We have our 5 scenes on our controller, and we monitor the DALI bus for certain control signals. And when we see their system change to scene 1, we change to our scene 1. And it's really used as an integration protocol. It's one of the ways that we can bolt on really good DMX control onto an existing system that might have DALI as an option.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I hadn't heard of that before. You hear a lot of different integration formats using, for instance, RS-232 or UDP, but using DALI as a way to integrate is really fascinating, because you're right. There are structures out there that have an existing dolly system, so why not tap into it? And the use case you just used is really fascinating, because you're almost like creating a little miniature theatrical environment that you're just like waiting for that command to be sent, and then you follow suit.
Yep. I mean, I think DMX, well, a lot of the ways Pharos gets involved in bigger projects is we're a co-processor. So we know we do all our things really well on our controller. We can have, lots of different scenes, timelines, dynamic timelines, astronomical timelines that follow the rhythms of the sun, conditional logic. But at the end of the day, our unit needs to be told what to do when. And for a show or just a simple scene to get activated on our system, at least conventional dolly as we used to know it, contained, you could have 64 ballasts, and each of those ballasts could remember one of, being part of 16 groups and having 16 scenes and having 16 feign times. It was all about 16. And we can pick up on each one of those points and in a matrix map that to different scenes on our end or different events on our end. And we've done a lot of things. I did a parking garage it was a parking garage where they had a show that would play inside the parking garage. They had no way other than turning off the lights, which were dolly. I don't know why it was dolly in the US, but it was. And when they ran the show, they dimmed the lights down to 50%. And we saw that and we said, oh, it's time for a show. We ran a 2-minute color sequence. And then when the lights came back up to full, we'd kill our show and wait for the next time that they called for that show. And that just was the easiest thing to do at the time. Sometimes we find that we're so uber flexible in terms of our integration to take lots of different stimulus that we expect out of others, but sometimes that's not the case. And so in this case, that control system had no way to send an Ethernet command, and dolly seemed to be a common denominator.
Gotcha. Interesting. And I think, that also lends into that whole discussion of DMX being for fixtures, because, the platform that you guys have is so flexible and so easy to integrate with other things, because of the fact that you're always getting these calls of like, how do we add DMX to our system? Well, now you've got this Swiss Army blade of devices to choose from for which protocol you need to integrate with.
Yeah. I mean, our history, as you may know, we were contacted back in, I think, 2004 from the theme park industry, and the theme park industry said, we know how to run a lighting console, we have DMX gear to control, but we just need something that can take some logic and day in and day out become our lighting playback controller. We tell it to go, it goes, it resets, we tell it to go again 4 minutes later and it does the same thing. And that's sort of where our LPC was birthed from, is that ability to stick DMX in a small architectural savvy box and have it just sit there and be really good at listening to everybody and making its decisions on what to do and then doing it for DMX.
And so
very curious.
Yeah, and so this demand for DMX motivated that. It wasn't the other way around, where in a lot of cases you see people trying to argue for dolly or argue for 0 to 10 or something. There was already demand for DMX. Yep. There just wasn't anything to fill that demand.
Certainly there was, but not at a cost point that was reasonable.
Right.
Some of the big theatrical companies that make controls have fantastic, playback or rack mount units that can basically a console in a box that you could mount and use on an architectural project. But you were literally putting a full-blown theatrical console into a museum or into a hotel lobby, and it was great at the time, but it was tough to do and keep it on budget.
And so ultimately that's where it's kind of that triangle of, you can either have it good, fast, or cheap, and you can't have all three. So, in your case, I guess it's good and cheap, maybe fast.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are, I think we're a good Swiss Army knife for DMX right now in the industry. Certainly, there are lots of companies that can do DMX, and we, we try really hard to sort of adapt to what the project needs are, and having all those different blades to pull out and to say, oh, but wait, we could do this, or we could do that, or oh, you need something to go between these two pieces of equipment. Well, at the same time we do lighting control, we can certainly take your serial and convert it and send Ethernet to the audio player. That's no problem. We'll just do that as a coprocessor. So there's a lot. It's really a kind of a great platform that sticks into a lot of places. DMX though is, I mean, you guys may have a comment on this, but in terms of DMX and architecture, being sold through the channels that have traditionally sold traditional fixtures and pipe and wire and all that, we see that still as a challenge though with the industry, and enough people knowing enough about DMX, enough about the wiring, taking care of the protocol to get a project done without having an army of experts around to help guide and test and prepare the DMX for the control system.
It's that's definitely still a problem, right? I mean, we all see that still, right? So we deal with a lot of projects, that get sold through distribution, and unfortunately, like you said, a lot of those distributors, the rep behind them may have a really good handle on it, right? And they have a team behind them, but the distributor themselves, in many cases, does not, right? And that's where the stumbling blocks happen. And then depending on the electrical contractor, there can be a lot of hangups, and it takes a lot to get from person to person to person and get the correct information because of that sort of flow in that chain. So it can be problematic, and that is where the role of the integrator has become so important these days. But yeah, so but I'm curious. So like you mentioned the LPC sort of being born from that need, and the LPC being so small, right? And consoles typically being so much larger. And I know we've encountered this ourselves, right? Where
for anybody who's watching, he's holding up an LPC.
Yeah, exactly.
We had that happen ourselves on a project where the designer specified a lighting console to put in an outdoor enclosure on a bridge. And the outdoor enclosure, of course, at the time, didn't have any AC or anything, and the console kept overheating. And it didn't have any way of dealing with the heat and the thermal. And the LPC was sort of designed, again, not to be, not to deal with, extreme temperatures, but was certainly capable of handling much higher temperature points than a traditional console with a spinning hard drive was able to handle. So there's a lot of, and again, the physical size makes it a lot easier to stick into a small cabinet on the side of a roadway or something. So,
yeah. Well, I think a lot of our size also comes a little bit to our technology. So not to disclose anything that's proprietary, but a lot of small playback devices tend to generate their output based on a frame store. So they basically store each frame of DMX and what it should be, where we actually don't have to have all that storage. So we do it slightly differently. So we don't have to have a huge hard drive or SSD or a huge, compact flash card or whatever it might be, because we're actually generating every frame of DMX based on logic. And we have to do that because every frame of DMX needs to go through all the different mechanisms that can generate output of our unit and figure out a priority system, because we have priorities. We have the ability to have scenes with transparency. And so on every one of those 33 refreshes a second, we need to go through all of our playback devices. Is the group being told this? Is the group being told this by a scene? Is it being told it by a timeline? And eventually the priority system ends up at the bottom of the stack with, okay, here's the DMX to send out. And I think that's been one of our biggest, selling points, is all that dynamic control where, lots of stuff can happen really fast on these small little processors. And it's really funny because, the actual processor in a lot of our equipment is still, probably 10 years old at this point. And it's due for a refresh. I can't wait for what extra power we'll be able to bring when that happens, because these things, are really fast now. But yeah, the temperature thing, the environmentals, that was definitely a consideration. And we have units that are underneath your seat on a roller coaster. Some of those survive. Some don't. Some do. A couple of the theme parks that have used them have done some conformal coating on them to kind of keep things in place. That's proved a lot better, but those are custom situations. But that's sort of the type of environment we have on them in the base of light poles in Chicago that help to drive lighting down Congress Avenue. So they have a pretty wide tolerance, and they're small, and that really is really helpful. Yeah.
So just curious,
Yeah, sure.
and maybe we can't peek behind the curtain on this regard, but I mean, because
Sure.
it's small, is there a limitation due to its scale as opposed to a full theatrical console?
So yeah, I mean, we're good at so many things, but obviously we have a list of things we're not so good at. Scale-wise is something we are good at. Our style of control can push up into the thousands of universes of DMX. Obviously, DMX, we defined it a little earlier, but it's basically based on an RS-45 serial protocol. And that protocol can only handle 170-ish color-changing fixtures. So when you're doing 3,000 universes, which is our top unit, most of that data is going out over Ethernet. And so we're using an Ethernet backbone to deliver that data. But scale is that's probably something that goes in our favor. Flexibility goes with our favor. Integration goes with our favor. I think one of the things that we don't do as well as an entertainment console is we haven't focused our energies on moving lights. So a lot of the entertainment consoles are now much more savvy with operating moving lights or fixtures that have non-intensity parameters. And so we still have a great mechanism and a great system for operating movers, but it's not had much attention. So a Pharos system of 25, 30 moving lights is probably all I do. I probably wouldn't do any more, and I'd probably be going nuts. 10's probably really good.
Right.
But if you're doing some simple things, some simple ballyhoos, or some simple things in a museum that has to happen, daily, but while also giving a customer maybe a touch screen so that they can change the color if they want, or change the patterns in an architectural touchscreen or environment, that's great. But that's probably one thing we don't do as well as a full entertainment console.
But like a Broadway programmer would never ever consider, because your user interface is very different from a theatrical console. So I mean, as far as like you said, it's more for a permanent and recurring space than it is a flexible dynamic space like a theatrical production. And so that's why moving heads would be so clunky. You don't have like encoders, which are these wheels that you can spin mechanically to adjust focus.
Yeah. I mean, we've done some custom projects where we have outfitted an iPad with similar controls, but again, you don't have a tactile button or a tactile knob to touch. So yeah, that definitely is one of those separators. And also consoles today have, they've got Intel processors in them or similar. They have a lot more power to offer the user macros and shortcuts and ways to group fixtures and group parameters and get access to them really quickly on physical buttons, where our controller is really meant for playback. So you use a PC program or Mac to design your lighting system, your logic, your lighting, your scenes, your colors. You do all that on the computer. And the Broadway designer is like, no, I'm not doing that. So, or the Broadway programmer. It's very much about that tactile feel.
That's where sometimes, having the bigger control manufacturers involved is better, because you can program on the console and then bring your save state over to their own proprietary system and just launch it that way. But, again, to your point, that's a really expensive and big implementation. Whereas for you, you're trying to find those smaller, more flexible, or more expansive scenarios.
Yeah, I will say that there are systems out there that can do snapshot and recording of DMX, and I think that's a really powerful feature that I think the lighting designers and the console operators have been asking for ages. Hey, I want to bring the console I know. Yeah, this guy over here. I want to bring the console I know. I want to bring that into the site. I want to design all the scenes and all that stuff on, the $50,000 console or whatever it might be. I'm making that up. And then I want to be able to.
Not too far off in some cases.
Probably. And I want to take all that programming that I can do very fast on this large console, and I want to bundle it up, and I want to stick it in a small playback controller, and that's going to sit there day in and day out and run the museum, rather than having to go buy a second big thing. So that's one of the places that we haven't been as good, because we haven't offered that feature. But that may be something that you might see from us in the future, because I think that's a definite.
Well, you'll make Ron very happy, because
I think I hinted at two things so far on this podcast. One is, we know our LPC processor probably needs a refresh soon. So if you put two and two together, someone might say, you're probably thinking about, what the next evolution of controller is. So you might be right. I cannot confirm or deny. But obviously, with more processing power also gives us maybe some more flexibility to do some of these things that were hard, that we could make it easier to do. And so it's one of the things that I think we're focusing on this year, to figure out how we can better address people that want to bring in the larger console and then have a really good, robust, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year playback controller, just operating that particular installation without the need for that big console.
Well,
I love it.
Interesting. We'll be interested to hear if that does get implemented.
Yeah, probably in like 2028. So no, I'm just kidding.
Well, we'll bring you back when it's out.
No, it should be fun, and we'd like to do it. So I think we're going to try to put our heads together to figure out a way to do it. So
no,
nice.
And I think a number of groups are coming out with that feature. So it is a commonly requested. It's not just inside this circle of three.
Yeah.
No,
and certainly it's not needed for everything, right? I mean, like you said, there's a lot of things that Pharos does very, very well. And so from an architectural standpoint, facades, things like that, there's no reason that personally that I feel to use a lot of other controllers for certain things. But like you said, moving lights specifically, I had to program 4 moving lights on an LPC, and I wanted to just shoot myself. I was like, I'm all done with this. So, right. I mean, so there's been applications where I've used the LPC as my front end to handle all my LEDs and do this and do that. But then I'm talking to a third party device that is just going to do my streaming, my playback for my movers and other devices. So,
and we definitely see that exact sort of setup in places that we we get involved with movers where people don't want to deal with our software for movers. I mean, we have a lot of flexibility. The thing is, we just don't offer a lot of tools for the user to do it fast. So we can do everything that a designer might like to do, but it's hard to do it fast. So a person on a console would do it in 5 minutes. We might need 35 minutes to structure, you know, all the positions, all the focus points, all the colors, all the gobos, all the groups, and get them into a point where we have sort of a, I don't want to use the word palette because we don't use that anywhere in our software, but essentially you have to create your own palette system so that then you can go do the art that's, you know, being requested of you. So it takes time. And, you know, in today's day and age, the console is a faster tool for that.
Yep.
So we'd love to help bridge the gap. So it's one of those things where market feedback has told us, you know, hey, you have a great playback unit. It would be really great if we could pump other things into your unit for playback. And so that's going to get explored, I think. So cool.
Now to throw a curveball at you.
Okay, great.
Since
Curveball.
Since you've talked about you know, odd installations, what's the weirdest installation that you've had to do?
I think I'd have to say, rather than it being weird, I would classify it more as a challenge.
Sure.
So early in my career with Pharos, I explored fountain control and seeing if the fountain jets, the fountain lighting, whether we could be that sort of head-end controller to replace a system that had to have 3 controllers in it. It needed a PLC to do this logic, it needed a lighting playback unit, it had to do an audio thing, and so on and so forth. And we ended up doing a project for an indoor fountain inside a casino where it had lots of different dynamic effects, both lighting and water and air. And we had the Pharos unit controlling it all, including handling all of the e-stops, monitoring water tank fill levels, auto-filling tanks, and we did all the logic on Pharos. And it was really fun to see it all working. So I think that was probably the most oddball project, given that there was actually more water management and emergency management in our controller than there actually was lighting control.
No, I can definitely see that. So I mean, ultimately, you were sending out the control signals for all of these things, as well as monitoring everything, so that if, for instance, the water level in a tank dropped below a critical level, you would stop the operation of the jet, essentially, right?
Or if it got below 80%, we'd open a valve using a contact closure to top up the tank. You know, we were controlling air pumps to run air bubblers to make certain things in the fountain bubble, but it was all part of a show too. So our timeline programming, being able to not just program a scene that starts and stops, but our timeline programming, where we can program something to happen in different bits over time, that was really cool to see that, because we could layer on top of that timeline, we could layer lighting, we could layer air for moving these bubblers, we could be doing pumps and jets to fire off different types or different circuits of water going to different types of jets. And we ended up doing, I think, 3 installations. They had 3 sites, and we did the first one, and then we did 2 more. So it was quite interesting. It was quite cool. The pumps are now, a lot of the pumps are run via variable frequency drives. So literally we could run DMX to the pumps, and we could vary the speed of the pumps, so we could vary the height of the jets, and then we could layer music in on it. So it was kind of fun. Haven't done one since.
It sounds like a blast, though. I mean, you know, there's so much going on in there, and it's not just software. I mean, sometimes you hear about these, and it's all software, but in this case, you're dealing with not just software. You're dealing with hundreds of handshakes happening simultaneously. You're dealing with a pre-programmed state, but then also emergent states on top of
Yep.
that. So that's really fascinating. Is there like a case study report on that?
I don't think there is, but it's funny you mentioned state, because we had to create a state engine. We had to basically say, okay,
Mhm.
the system is in these states, and so all the logic would check the state before it would do something. Obviously
Right.
emergency being one of the states.
Right.
The other interesting thing was transducers. So we had transducers giving us ultrasonic transducers giving us levels in the tanks, and we were able to take the transducer information and actually put it on a touchscreen using our sliders as
Huh.
level indicators. So you'd never touch the
Interesting.
slider. It was just
Right.
there as a level indicator to show you, how full the tanks
Interesting.
were. So, yeah, no, that's pretty cool. So, a case study would be interesting for sure.
For
But that
sure.
state
No, I mean,
engine is the state engine is actually something that that we've that's tough to do with such a flexible product. And our newer products that we're releasing this year, our expert controllers, they have a full state engine. So you're either in day mode and you're in night mode, or you're in I'm open mode or I'm closed. And those states, very much like the fountain, those states are things that are sort of governing how the daily operation of a system works, pertaining to the DMX and Dolly output.
And so just to qualify that a little bit more, because I imagine that some people listening are going to go, wait a second, it doesn't already do that. What is the difference between a state engine and a non-state engine?
Well, I think there's probably a ton of answers to that, but
Sure.
when it pertains to our system, so Pharos traditionally has been a lax action takes precedence. So whatever most recently occurs for a message to do something usually takes over. But we've then put in certain conditional logic to check whether that occurrence is at a particular priority level. Is it high priority? Is it low priority? And so you actually have a state system running all the time when it comes to letting playback. When you start doing more logic control, where you need to have more if-then statements, then you usually crack into our scripting language. And before I knew scripting, I would tell a timeline to start, and I'd name that timeline day mode, and I'd tell that timeline to loop. And what I would do is, if somebody said turn on the lights, I would put a bit of conditional logic in that said, is the daytime timeline running? And if it was, I'd go turn on scene 1. If it wasn't, then that rule would jump to the next rule to say, is timeline evening running? And it would then play a different scene. So you sort of have the flexibility to set up all your own state and logic systems within our priority framework. And that's sort of what gives us our uber flexibility, is you could have one Pharos operating one project, or you could have one Pharos operating 16 projects, and you can customize the state system for each one of those projects. Where something like a home automation system, their state engines are usually based on your home. You have, vacation mode, day mode, I'm home mode, I'm away mode, or the alarm set mode. And that's it. And that governs how everything works in the home. And we're bringing a little bit of that sort of compartmentalizing of a state system to DMX control in our new products in order to simplify them. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out how to create a state engine for 16 projects.
Right.
You have one, and the one is customizable, but you still only have one. So it's probably just a difference in terms of what sort of power you need for the type of project you're doing. Having uber flexibility to sort of write your own states as you go, which is our designer range of LPCs, or being able to just do some really great lighting, great scene control, great control in general, but have it based on a simpler fixed state system like in our expert range of products.
Interesting. Yeah. So I mean, ultimately, it's about how you interact with it rather than the
Yeah.
actual performance capabilities of it. So if you are, a scripting person and you really get into it, you could still achieve everything you need out of the box. But that's where, the majority of people don't function with scripting. They don't think
Yep.
in scripting language, and so having a user interface that's more accessible is where it comes into play. So that's what you mean by a state engine, is that it is a user interface designed to help you create states.
Correct. It's a user interface that speaks sort of the language of the person, that says, okay, I have rooms and I have zones and I have lights and I have colors, and I just need these to be on at this time of day and I need these to be on at that time of day. We make the user interface click, click, click really easy for that, versus the designer system. It's a little bit harder to put that in because you get to make so many different choices to customize exactly how that works. So there's certainly that ease of use and that flexibility that defines sort of our two ranges right now.
Sure.
And you're right, not many people go into scripting. And many times what people do use scripting for, you still could do conventionally with conditional logic that we present in the user interface. But sometimes scripting is faster. We do have sort of a not a motto, but a saying in our support system, which is, we remind ourselves that we actually give people enough rope to hang themselves with our designer range of products, because, you can write scripts that debilitate and disable the unit. You sort of have to know what you're doing. So it's like, make sure if somebody's really digging into our scripting language deep, make sure you explain to them the rope and how much of it you're doling out to them, so they don't get themselves into a pickle. But most times they don't. Most times they do some really great work. So.
Well, and I'm curious, Ron, you're usually the one who interacts with that. How frequently do you break out the script?
Oh, so personally, I don't script. That's why we have John. John is amazing. John is our programmer. He's fantastic. He handles all of the scripting. I can do enough to be dangerous, and I can handle simple projects by myself, and I'm good with that, and I can set it all up, and I can do the integrations. The scripting is all John. He handles all the custom scripting. I can work within Designer and do a lot myself, but no, man.
So I mean, ultimately, yeah. I mean, even the integrators, for the most part, there's usually a scripting or a couple of scripting experts in house. But then outside of that, having this extra layer user interface is really essential to the success of your products.
Yeah, there's also there's a halfway point too, though, which is something that we try to remind people, and that is we have another concept called variables. And variables are great because they're so flexible, and you can when you think you might have to do something 25 times because you have 25 buttons on a touchscreen, you can use variables to help make some of that programming faster, because you only have to do it once. For example, if we had 25 buttons that start 25 scenes, under the hood, we can give those buttons their names. So we'll name them button 1, button 2, button 3. But we can tell the system to listen for any button press. But if you're listening for any button press, when that button press comes in, figure out what number button it is. Let's say it's 5. And whatever number that is, why don't you start the scene that has the same number? And so now, rather than putting 25 rules in our system, you've put one that says when a button's pressed, release all the previous timelines or scenes and start the scene that equals the number that was pressed. And so understanding variables and wildcards actually is that first step that we try to teach people before we tell them to go into scripting. Certainly scripting can do the exact same thing. We can say, capture the number, bring it into a script. Maybe we need to transpose the number, or we need to take a number between 1 and 10, and we need to calculate the final variable is a number between 0 and 255. So you can do all that math in a script, but the variables in terms of their simplicity and just like button presses or a DMX input to trigger something in our system, it's like we can listen for not just the DMX channel number, but what value it is. And based on the value, we can do something different. So those variables come in handy. So,
Sure.
And the user interface does make that easier than jumping into a big white screen where you're starting to write script and code.
Right. Absolutely. Well, we're almost out of time, so I'm just going to quickly summarize because I mean, this is cool stuff, and I'm really excited to see where you go next with everything. But as far as your role in the industry, you're really filling in something that had been demanded for a while, which was a small, cost-effective DMX solution that could integrate with other systems. And that's really kind of what you've done going forward. You're just adding to the capabilities of that Swiss Army blade DMX solution. And so anything that we're seeing coming out this year is just adding to that ecosystem, making it more robust, more user friendly. And so, but the thing is that, DMX is not going away. It's just getting more and more in demand nowadays. And because of how robust and dynamic it is, how fast it is, how it communicates to the fixtures, it ticks all the boxes that people want for these dynamic color changing fixtures, which Dolly can sometimes do, but not always. And so while we're seeing Dolly being used as a back-end networking protocol, it's not really being used to communicate out to the fixtures the same way DMX is. And so that's why having a solution like what you have is essential to success of a project sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, it's also the evolution of coming from the entertainment industry and moving into the architainment section of the industry. And I think what you're seeing more and more from us is ways that we can do things better for architecture. And who knows how long DMX will be the architecture go-to fast protocol.
Sure.
We didn't touch upon other technologies that are happening, wireless being one of them. It's like what part does that have to play moving forward in time? So, I mean, it's really a fun industry, and I think it's very responsive to other technologies that help that we see that usually takes a couple of years for that technology to find its way into lighting. We're not at the very forefront, but I think there's stuff that I've seen today that it'll be really curious to see how that works its way into the lighting industry moving forward. So, I mean, we're planning on DMX being here for a while, but who knows? Maybe it won't. But for right now, it's a great way for fixture manufacturers to add drivers to their fixtures that can take either just DMX or a mixture of DMX or Dolly and make that fixture really flexible for whatever control system gets specified.
Sure.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. This was an awesome conversation.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me. It was great.
Well, that was a really awesome conversation. Love talking to Tom. Tom has some really great stuff to talk about when it comes to Pharos. Pharos brings great solutions to a project. So definitely an awesome time. And again, loved hearing about that fountain. Really cool stuff. Would have loved to design that myself. But at any rate, just want to let you know that this podcast is presented by the Lighting Controls Association, or LCA.
And financially supported by NAIL, the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors. And please do not forget to check out the Lighting Controls podcast online. You can find us on all your social media platforms. You can find us on the website. You can subscribe to your favorite podcast platform. You can check out all your sweet merchandise, get yourself some shirts, get a hat, anything, coffee cup like Webster has. I'm trying to point at his cup. This isn't going to work. You guys can't see that. He's not below you, but it's fine. And now, just to remind you guys about some of the upcoming instructional videos and in-person events that we'll be at.
Yeah, so, if you want to learn more about lighting controls, we've got some great stuff coming up. There's going to be a link in the description to check out Southern California Edison, and check us out at Light Fair. Thank you so much for joining us, and thanks, Tom.